Genoese crossbowmen were some of the most sought-after mercenaries in Europe for much of the Middle Ages. They earned a reputation as fierce, reliable, and effective warriors by defending their home republic and by serving in many of Europe's armies. When their emblem, the banner of St. George, appeared on the horizon, many brave soldiers trembled, and quite a few commanders changed their strategy at the last moment. Their most famous battle, as well as their greatest defeat, was the Battle of Crécy in 1346. Before diving deep into their origins, how they fought, and what made them effective, let me introduce you to today's sponsor, CuriosityStream, who we appreciate greatly, both in terms of their service and our long-standing cooperation. CuriosityStream is home to thousands of streamable documentaries and non-fiction TV shows on topics like history, nature, science, and more. Today, we want to recommend their 3-part series, Knights. It traces the evolution of knights from the early Middle Ages to their demise. Whether it's questions of honor, courtly love, or the Crusades, this documentary covers it all. The 3rd part of the series stands out to us because it leads into topics we covered extensively on our channel, such as the rise of muskets and cannons, which was one of the main factors that made the armored knight a thing of the past. For our viewers, this documentary might help better understand both warfare in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. CuriosityStream is available for just $14.99 for 1 whole year, if you use our link, which you'll find in the description box or the pinned comment, or simply use code SandroMan while signing up. This way you get a 25% discount and help out our channel. Now let's jump back to the video. The Genoese crossbowmen originated in the late 11th and early 12th century. Earlier, the Genoese had already relied on crossbowmen occasionally, but in that period, Genoa decided to establish a regimented corps of selected crossbowmen for certain tactical tasks. Within a few years, this corps developed into an elite force that formed the core of the Genoese army. Why the Republic chose crossbowmen of all things is not conclusive. The research situation is difficult. As the Italian historian Fabio Romanoni explains, historical works on the Genoese crossbowmen are extremely rare, although contemporaries held them in the same regard as other mercenaries such as the famous Swiss mercenaries or the Brabançons. Nevertheless, there are quite a few interesting things we do know about them. Not just anyone could become a Genoese crossbowman. The requirements for recruitment were strict, and only selected recruits were admitted. Contrary to what the name suggests, they came from all over Liguria, some from even further away. Romanoni has examined medieval primary sources from 1327 and found that most of the recruits belonged to the lower strata of society. Most came from the outskirts of Genoa, Savona, Oltrogioco, Montferrat, the Po Valley, and even from Corsica. When there was need for new crossbowmen, the Genoese War Council elected 2 experienced men, usually noblemen, to organize and oversee the recruitment. They evaluated the recruits according to their physical aptitude, experience, and talent in handling weapons. Among other things, the recruits' resilience to mental pressure and their eyesight were tested. Those selected then had to swear allegiance to the Republic and provide a guarantor. The guarantor assured the recruits' loyalty and had to refund their pay in case of desertion or insubordination. Once the oath had been taken and the guarantor named, new recruits received their pay, which varied according to rank and duty. The term of service was usually limited to less than a year, often only 3 months or half a year. Once the contract was signed, the recruits were sent to Genoa, where they learned the art of fighting with the crossbow. Their weapon became popular in Western Europe in the 11th century. Its origins, however, go back much further, but for a long time it was rarely used in most of Europe. But the military men of the time were fascinated by the crossbow's penetrating power and efficiency. Also, it could be used with relatively little training compared to longbows. Therefore, the crossbow rapidly spread across the continent. Of course, there was also opposition. For example, from Pope Urban II, who in 1193 prohibited the use of the weapon against fellow Christians, because it was considered unchivalrous due to its armor-piercing effect. He thought of it as an early cheat code, so to speak. But as happens so often, practical needs triumphed over moral norms. According to the expert for medieval military technology DeVries, the crossbow was popular with almost all armies in Europe from the 12th century onward. The Genoese crossbowmen used heavy crossbows made by the Ballistae, the Genoese guild of crossbow makers. Their build featured a stirrup and was loaded with the help of a belt hook that the crossbowman needed to wear all the times. In order to load, the shooter placed one foot in the stirrup at the front end of the crossbow, bent his knees slightly, hooked the hook into the string, and then pulled it back by straightening himself. The retracted string was then hooked into the so-called nut, and the crossbow was ready to fire. The earliest European crossbows, mostly used by the Genoese crossbowmen in the 12th, 13th, and early 14th centuries, had wooden bows. According to DeVries, these were gradually replaced by the stronger composite bows made of wood, animal sinews, as well as horn plates that were glued together. In the 15th century, bows made of steel appeared, perhaps first in Germany. Because these two latter types had much more draw weight, they could not be loaded with a belt hook. It required support tools such as pulleys, goat-foot levers, or crank winches. In terms of equipment, we can say that the Genoese crossbowmen weren't uniform, and their gear evolved over time. In the 13th century, the average soldier probably wore a light metal helmet, a breastplate, and chainmail. Daggers and very short swords were popular as secondary weapons, and everyone was required to carry at least 20 bolts. One crucial part of the equipment of the Genoese crossbowmen were the so-called pavises, which were man-sized shields that could be anchored in the ground by means of spikes at the lower end. Presumably, these shields were carried and held by a squire, who in some cases was accompanied by an additional infantryman. The crossbowmen carrying these huge shields on their backs and simply turning around to load, as for example in the game Total War, is considered very unlikely. The Genoese crossbowmen also fought in defense of fortresses and on ships. For much of the 13th to the 15th century, Genoese ships were required to have a minimum number of crossbowmen on board. They played a decisive role, for example, in the naval battles of Meloria in 1284 and Curzola in 1298. Organizationally, the crossbowmen were divided into groups called bandiere and were commanded by a sergeant. These could then be combined into companies of a few hundred to a few thousand men, under the high command of a Genoese commander-in-chief. The Republic of Genoa tried to control the use of its crossbowmen as best as it could. Technically, only the government could authorize the deployment of its soldiers outside the Republic's borders. The crossbowmen were forbidden to enter the service of another lord on their own. Of course, this was not observed nearly as strictly as the Republic had wished, especially not by the condottieri, the Italian mercenary captains. The first deployment of Genoese crossbowmen outside Italy was probably in 1099, during the siege of Jerusalem in the First Crusade. Under the Genoese admiral Guglielmo Embriaco, known as Testa di Maglio, the Hammerhead, they were deployed against the mounted archers of the Mamluks. The first time Genoa provided crossbowmen to another Italian city is documented in 1173, when the Margravate of Gavi received an unknown number of crossbowmen for defensive purposes. While we don't know much more about what happened there, we do get some clues about how the crossbowmen fought in an engagement some 20 years later. In 1192, during the Third Crusade, some Genoese crossbowmen received orders from Richard the Lionheart himself, who was defending the city of Jaffa against Sultan Saladin's men. According to the historian Aldo Setia, he ordered the pavis bearers and spearmen to form a rampart of shields and spears. From this safe position, the crossbowmen, who formed two lines and alternated loading and firing, beat back the attackers. Whether the Genoese fought like this regularly is unclear. We do know for sure that they took cover behind the pavis shields to load, which took them about 10 seconds with the belt hook. There is also some evidence that they fought in teams of 3, that is, a squire holding the shield and 2 crossbowmen, of which one was reloading while the other one was taking a shot. While the shields were indispensable as cover, they also made quick movement on the battlefield very cumbersome. In general, the tactical deployment of the crossbowmen in battle had to be well considered. The basic requirements for them to fight efficiently were twofold. They needed dry and solid ground and a clear field of fire. This implies that crossbowmen could be positioned either in front of the rest of the infantry on the flanks, or on a hill. Crossbows could be shot in an arch or directly at the target. The latter mode of fire was more precise, but it required a clear line of fire. Therefore, it was quite common that the crossbowmen opened the battle by shooting a few volleys, but then allowed the melee troops to pass through their lines and finally move to the flanks to strike again later on. While the Genoese served mainly in the armies of the city-states of northern Italy, they soon also entered foreign service. They served in particularly large numbers in France during the 100 Years' War. It was there, in 1346, that they fought their most famous battle, the Battle of Crécy. In the summer of that year, Edward III of England attacked France from 3 sides to press his claims to the French throne. He himself landed in Normandy on the 12th of July with an army of 7,000 to 15,000 men and marched plundering towards Paris. Philip VI of France gathered an army as quickly as he could and then stuck to the heels of the English as they turned north near Poissy. After initial engagements at the Somme River, where the French in vain tried to stop the English, Edward deployed his army on a strong position near Crécy and awaited the French attack. According to the historian Clifford J. Rogers, Philip's army was 2 to 3 times larger and consisted of about 8,000 men-at-arms, 16 to 20,000 ordinary infantrymen, and 2 to 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen. The latter were to play a decisive role in the upcoming battle. Unfortunately, we know very little about them, except for the fact that their leaders, Carlo Grimaldi and Aitone Doria, who both belonged to the leading families of Genoa, had both fallen from grace in Genoa and served as mercenaries for that reason. Their 2 companies, which as far as we know never fought together before Crécy, had at that point been in French service for 9 years. Grimaldi joined the French campaign after his galleys had entered the port of Rouen on the 20th of August. When Doria's men joined is unclear. Kelly DeVries speculates that they anchored their ships in the outlet of the Somme and met the army near Abbeville. When Philip ordered his men to march on the morning of the 26th of August, he did not know exactly what to expect. At the head of the long column, alongside the cavalry, marched the Genoese crossbowmen. This was unusual because the front was normally formed by the knights. According to DeVries, there are barely any other examples in which archers or crossbowmen marched in the vanguard of medieval armies. What makes this even more puzzling is that the Genoese equipment was transported at the rear of the convoy. They had their crossbows with them, but their pavises and probably some of their armor was out of reach. According to the historian Christian Teutsch, the French column was drawn out over 12 miles when the vanguard spotted the English army. Accordingly, the king wanted to let his men catch up before the attack, but the knights and nobles who were marching with him convinced him not to wait. Shortly after midday, there was a brief but intense rainstorm, which led historians to speculate about whether the Genoese crossbowmen were rendered useless because of the wet strings. Usually, this is contrasted with the English longbowmen who were able to de-string their bows quickly. However, DeVries thinks this argument makes no sense, as the crossbow strings were quite resistant to rain due to the materials they were made of. Also, as Christian Teutsch mentions, the attack began only some hours later in late afternoon. The first to advance were the crossbowmen. They were facing the English longbowmen who outnumbered them significantly, had a much higher rate of fire and a slightly higher range. This was even amplified by the fact that the English army held the high ground. The Genoese advanced, but after firing a few rounds, they were hit by a hail of English arrows. Without their pavises, and with only light armor and little ammunition, there was no way they could put up with this. They turned to flight very quickly. The Count of Alençon and his horsemen, who formed the second line, thought the Genoese were cowards, or worse, had betrayed the French. He could not understand their quick flight from battle. Apparently, as DeVries underlines, neither the Genoese crossbowmen nor the French knights had fought longbowmen before. Alençon was furious and ordered his men to advance and ride down the crossbowmen. However, when they came within range of the English, the knights became themselves acquainted with the devastating force of the English longbow. The confusion caused by the clash of the cavalry with their own crossbowmen made the attackers an easy target, so that the English archers combined with the 3 bombards wreaked havoc in the French lines. Despite all this, the French cavalry charged against the English army again and again, almost until midnight. Their charges, however, were hampered by a couple of factors. Firstly, the ground was muddy because of a quick and heavy downpour in the afternoon, and secondly, they had to advance uphill through English pitfalls and field fortifications. All the while, the English arrows hailed down on the French knights ceaselessly. Despite these adverse circumstances, a total of 15 waves of French cavalry advanced against the English lines. Philip reportedly retreated only after 2 horses were killed under him, and he was left no other choice than to retreat. Hours after he had abandoned the battle, French infantrymen continued to arrive on the battlefield, and with them, way too late, the futile equipment of the Genoese Crossbowmen. Most historians estimate the French casualties at about 15,000. Those of the English were negligible: 2 knights, 40 men-at-arms, and a few archers and spearmen. How many of the Genoese lost their life on the field of Crécy is unknown, and there is no way to tell. But it must have been many. Riddled with English arrows, run over by their own cavalry, and caught between the fronts, a large part of them must have been wiped out. The Battle of Crécy is one of the most discussed events of the 100 Years' War. It is considered the battle in which the English longbow demonstrated its superior effectiveness, which is, of course, disputed. Despite this heavy defeat, the Genoese crossbowmen remained some of the most sought-after mercenaries for quite a while. Only when a crossbow was gradually replaced by firearms and developed into a mere hunting weapon did the Genoese crossbowmen also disappear from the battlefields of Europe.